along the lines of wakefulness, I have a number of questions about caffeine.
Yeah.
The dreaded and beloved caffeine.
Yeah.
I love caffeine, but I like it in relatively restricted periods of time. So I'm a big fan of waking up, and even though I wake up very groggy, allowing my natural wakefulness signals to take hold, meaning I wake up very slowly, but I don't drink caffeine right away. I've sort of delay caffeine by a little while, usually 90 minutes to 2 hours.
Okay.
And that idea came to me on the basis of my understanding of how caffeine and the adenosine receptor interact. I have a feeling you're going to pronounce adenosine differently than I do.
No. I will go with it. I will go with adenosine.
I'll try to go with your skeletal instead of skeletal, and synapse and synapse.
Schedule and schedule.
There we go. But to make it really simple for folks, how does caffeine work to make us feel more alert? And does the timing in which we ingest caffeine play an important role in whether or not it works for us or against us? So maybe we just start with, how does caffeine work? Why is it that when I drink mate or coffee, which are my preferred sources of caffeine, do I feel a mental and physical lift?
Yeah. So I'm going to suggest, counter to what most people would think, drink coffee.
Or mate. Is mate okay also?
Yeah.
Or whatever form you enjoy.
Well, we'll come on to sort of why I suggest that, but when it comes to coffee, I would say the dose and the timing makes the poison. Mm-hmm. So let's start with how caffeine works. Caffeine is in a class of drugs that we call the psychoactive stimulants. So it works through a variety of mechanisms. One is a dopamine mechanism. Dopamine we often think of as a reward chemical, but dopamine is also very much an alerting neurochemical as well. And caffeine has some role, it seems, to play in increasing dopamine. But its principal mode of action, we believe, in terms of making me more alert and keeping me awake throughout the day, is on the effects of adenosine. And to explain what adenosine is, from the moment that you and I woke up this morning, this chemical adenosine has been building up in our brain. And the longer that we're awake, the more of that adenosine accumulates.
Is it, may I ask, is it accumulating in neurons, in glia, or in the blood vessels? Where, and is it also accumulating in my body? Where is this adenosine coming from, and where is it accumulating?
Yeah, so the adenosine here that we're talking about that is creating the sleep pressure is a central brain phenomenon, mm-hmm. and it comes from the neurons themselves combusting energy. Mm-hmm. And as they're combusting energy, one of the offshoots of that is this chemical adenosine.
Okay.
And so as we're awake throughout the day and our brain is metabolically very active, it's accumulating and building up this adenosine. Now, the more adenosine that we have, the sleepier that we will feel. So it really is like a sleep pressure is what we call it. Now, it's not a mechanical pressure. Don't worry, your head's not going to explode. Mm-hmm. It's a chemical pressure. And it's this weight of sleepiness that we feel gradually growing as we get into the evening.
May I just interrupt you again to just ask, do we know what the circuit mechanism is for that? I mean, not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but for the aficionados and for myself, we have brain mechanisms like locus ceruleus that release things, brain areas, locus ceruleus just being a brain area, of course, that release things that proactively create wakefulness.
Yeah.
So are those neurons shutting down as a consequence of having too much adenosine, or are there areas of the brain that promote sleepiness that are becoming activated? Because you can imagine both things working in parallel. Yep. One or the other would accomplish the same endpoint.
Yeah, and it's both. And so there are two main receptors for adenosine, the A1 receptor and the A2 receptor, and they have different modes of activating brain cells or inactivating or decreasing the likelihood of firing. And adenosine works in this beautiful, elegant way where it will inhibit and shut down the wake-promoting areas of the brain, whilst also increasing and dialing up the volume on sleep-activating, sleep-promoting
so
region.
Beautiful.
Oh,
it's always
fantastic.
A push-pull.
Yeah.
I mean, we could have a larger discussion at some point about that. everything, seeing dark edges, seeing light edges,
Yeah.
our ability to smell or to sense pressure on this. Everything's a push-pull.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, yep.
So this is another example where as I am awake longer, adenosine is released in the brain and my wakefulness areas are being actively shut down by that adenosine, and my sleepiness brain areas, so to speak, are being promoted to be more active. Is that correct?
That's right. And it's a very progressive process. It's not like a step function and sometimes that happens occasionally, but it's usually because you've been sort of driving through and, as we'll come on to, have caffeine in the system. And then all of a sudden you just hit a wall and it just, engulfs you, and you go from a 0 to the 1 of sleepiness within a short period of time.
What explains the fatigue after a hard conversation? The desire to go to sleep, or the desire to go to sleep during a hard conversation?
That's an interesting one. I think it's usually just based on personality type interactions, and for the most part,
that I've ever experienced that.
No,
before,
people with you don't, but with me, they.
No. I've experienced the desire to some conversations. I'm halfway through them and I feel like I want to take a nap.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would love to look at people's sleep history. We've sort of seen that time and time again, but and then it could be with folks like me, people just lose the will to live within about 5 minutes of speaking with me. So
they hear that sleep is important. That's
unrelated,
all, so
and that's flattery. That's great. But so the way that then caffeine comes into this equation, as I was saying, it's usually a kind of a linear process, or maybe it's probably closer to an exponential in terms of your subjective feeling of sleepiness. And we haven't really been able to measure that in humans because normally it's hard to actually, stick something into the brain and be, siphoning off stuff every couple of minutes as you could do in animal studies, and keep asking people every couple of minutes, how sleepy do you feel? How sleepy? And track to see if there's a linear rise in, adenosine, which then creates an exponential rise in subjective sleepiness, or what the dynamics are. But I'm kind of nerding out. Caffeine comes into play here because caffeine comes into your system and it latches onto those welcome sites of adenosine, the adenosine receptors. But what it doesn't do is latch onto them and activate them, because if it was doing that, then it would, in lots of ways, it would dial up more sort of sleepiness. It does the opposite. The way that caffeine works is that it comes in, competes with quite sharp elbows with adenosine, competitively, forces them out of the way, hijacks that receptor by latching onto it, but then just essentially blocks it. It doesn't inactivate the receptor. It doesn't activate the receptor. It functionally inactivates it in the sense that it takes it out of the game for adenosine. So it's like someone, coming into a room and you're just about to sit down on the chair and caffeine comes in and just pulls out the chair and you're like, well, now I've got nowhere to sit. And caffeine just keeps pulling out the chairs from adenosine. And adenosine, even though it's at the same concentration in your brain doesn't know that you've been awake for, 10 hours, 16 hours at that point when you've downed a cup of coffee, because all of that adenosine that's still there can't communicate to the brain that you've been awake for 16 hours because
but the adenosine is still in brain circulation.
Correct.
So the real question is, what happens when caffeine is dislodged from the adenosine receptor?
Unfortunate things happen, and that's what we call the caffeine crash, which is caffeine has a half-life and it's metabolized.
Do you recall what the half-life is?
Yeah, the half-life is somewhere between 5 to 6 hours. And the quarter life, therefore, is somewhere between 10 to 12 hours. It's variable. Different people have different durations of its action, but for the average adult, 5 to 6 hours. That variation, we understand, it's down to a liver enzyme or a set of liver enzymes of the class that we call the cytochrome P450 enzymes. And there are two, I think last I delved into the data, which was pretty recently, there are 2 gene variants that will dictate the enzymatic speed with which the liver breaks down caffeine. And that's why you can have some people who are very sensitive to caffeine and other people who say, I'm just, it doesn't affect me really that much at all.
These are the people that have a double espresso after a 9 p.m. dinner and can sleep just fine.
Well, and we'll come
or
on to...
Or at least subjectively, they think they're sleeping.
Subjectively, yeah. And we should speak about that assumptive danger too. So then the caffeine is in the system, and after some time period, it will be inactive in the system. So let's say that, I've been awake for 12 hours now, and it's, 8 p.m., and I'm feeling a bit tired, but I want to push through and I want to keep working for another couple of hours. So I have a cup of coffee. All of a sudden, I was feeling tired, but I don't feel like I've been awake for 12 hours anymore, because with the caffeine in the system, maybe only half of that adenosine is being communicated through the receptor to my brain. 100% of the adenosine is still there. Only half of it is allowed to communicate to my brain. So now I think, I haven't been awake for 12 hours. I've just been awake for 6 hours. I feel great. Then after a few hours and the caffeine is starting to come out of my system, not only am I hit with the same levels of adenosine that I had before I'd had the cup of coffee several hours ago, it's that plus all of the adenosine that's been building up during the time that the caffeine has been in my system.
So sort of an avalanche of
it
adenosine.
Is a tsunami wave, yeah. And that's the caffeine crash.
And it's interesting because the caffeine crash at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when you have work to do is a terrible thing. But what about the person, maybe this person is me in my 20s, who says, I'm going to drink caffeine all day long, and then I want the crash because at 9 or 10 p.m., if I stop drinking caffeine at, say, 6 p.m., and I crash, then I crash into a slumber, a deep night of sleep.
Yeah.
Is that sleep really as deep as I think it is? Because given the half-life of caffeine that you mentioned a few moments ago, I have to imagine that having some of that caffeine circulating in my system might disrupt the depth of sleep or somehow the architecture of sleep in a way that even if I get 8 or who knows, even 10 hours of sleep, it might not be as restorative as I would like it to be.
Yeah. And that is the danger, just sort of that, those people that you described who say, and a lot of them will speak with me too, say, look, I can have 2 espressos with dinner and I fall asleep fine and I stay asleep. Because usually those are the 2 phenotypes that we typically see with too much caffeine. Mm-hmm. I just can't fall asleep as easily as I want to, or I fall asleep, but I just can't stay asleep. And caffeine can do both of those things quite potently.
How late in the day do you think is, assuming somebody, translate this, folks, if you go to bed earlier or later, you have to shift the hours accordingly, but given somebody who typically gets into bed around 10:30 and falls asleep around 11:30,
yeah.
When would you recommend they halt caffeine intake? And these are not strict prescriptives, but I think people do benefit from having some fairly clear guidelines of what might work for them. Would you say cut off caffeine by what time of the day?
I would usually say take your typical bedtime and count back sort of somewhere between 10 to 8 hours is probably getting a little bit close, but take back sort of 10 hours or 8 hours of time. That's the time when you should really stop, using caffeine is the suggestion. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because for those people who even just keep drinking up until, into the evening, you're right that they can fall asleep fine, maybe they stay asleep, but the depth of their deep sleep is not as deep anymore. And so there are 2 consequences. The first is that for me, and it can be up to by 30%, and for me to drop your deep sleep by 30%, I'd have to age you by between 10 to 12 years, or you can just do it every night to yourself with a couple of espressos. The second is that you then wake up the next morning and you think, well, I didn't have problems falling asleep and I didn't have problems staying asleep, but I don't feel particularly restored by my sleep. So now I'm reaching for 3 or 4 cups of coffee the next morning rather than just 2 or 3 cups of coffee. And so goes this dependency cycle that you then need your uppers to wake you up in the morning. And then sometimes people will use alcohol in the evening to bring them down because they're overly caffeinated. And alcohol, and we can speak about that too, also has very deleterious impacts on your sleep as well. So you're right that it's not just the quantity of your sleep or even difficulties falling or staying asleep. It can also be deep sleep. But here again, I think, I don't want to be frightening people. And I mentioned this before. I think one of the real problems or mistakes that I made, because I didn't, I'd never had much public exposure before the book. And I was so saddened by, the disease and the suffering that I was seeing as a consequence of a lack of sleep in our society. And the fact that it wasn't really being discussed very much. I sort of came out, a little bit headstrong, more than a little bit headstrong. And I think I was, perhaps too much gas pedal and too little, brake, as it were. And I don't think that's the right way to approach health message within the public sphere. And I've become much softer in how I think about these things. I have ideas about what the ideal world looks like for sleep, but I also realize that none of us live in this thing called the ideal world.
We certainly don't.
So, I want to be really mindful of that. And I think I've done a really bad job of being sort of too forthright, particularly for people who struggle with sleep. Early on when I would offer these sort of messages about sleep, I want to be veridical when it comes to the science. I want to be faithful to the science. But I also don't want to go out and scare the living daylights out of people, particularly people who are struggling with their sleep, because it's probably only going to make matters worse. So I've been beautifully schooled by learning how to be a slightly better public communicator. I'm nowhere near of the standing that you are. You're very elegant and it's very intuitive to you. I'm still with training wheels, but I'm getting a little bit better. But I just want to say that when I'm speaking about caffeine, because it sounds as though I'm very sort of overt about it. But I will come back to why I say drink coffee. But I just want to make that point.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you making that point, and I'm sure our listeners will too. I still will stand behind my statement, which is that what you've done for the notion that sleep is vital for all aspects of health and for performance, mental and physical and wakefulness. The message and the packaging it was contained in and has been clearly net positive. People needed to be cued to this.
Thank you.
The I'll sleep when I'm dead mentality is one that I had. It's one that other people have. People in a huge number of vital communities, not just your students, but also people. The messaging that you provided and continue to provide has positively impacted the first responder community, the medical community. There's still steps that need to be taken, the military community, and of course the civilian community. And so I think these adjustments about, caffeine's okay, just restrict it to the early part of the day if you can most days. I mean, I think the law of averages, it's like the light viewing behavior. I think it is critical to view sunlight or natural, some other form of bright light early in the day. But if you miss a day, it's not that your whole system is going to dissolve into a puddle of tears. Yeah. That'll happen on the second or the third day. No, I'm kidding. You get a couple days. Biology works in averages, except with respect to accident or injury. Yeah. A car accident is a car accident, right? You don't get to have 3 of those before the brain damage occurs if the accident is severe enough. Yeah. But with sleep behavior, or these homeostatic type behaviors, or with food, one chocolate sundae, is it going to kill you? No. Right. Every night, it's going to make you demented and kill you early. We know this. And so I think the middle ground is often a hard place to achieve. So I think you've done a phenomenal job, but I appreciate you raising these points. And I think it's clear that we all can and should do certain things better, including being gentle with ourselves from time to time when we